Okay, so now I'll introduce our speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Hugh Macintosh. He's an ecologist and taxonomist specializing in marine benthic invertebrates, particularly bivalves. Originally from BC, Hugh traveled to Australia to complete his PhD on wood-boring shipworms and spent a decade down under. Returned home in 2017, and since then he's taught classes at UVic and Bamfield Marine Station, and is now the collections manager for invertebrates at the Royal BC Museum. So tonight's topic is shipworms. So with that, I'll hand it over to Hugh.
Thanks very much, Phil. Thanks everyone for showing up and for coming to my talk. I get far too excited about things like shipworms, obscure clams and bivalves than most other people. So it was really nice to have the ability to do this kind of talk. With that introduction, I will kind of launch straight into what I'll usually talk about shipworms with people. Most people you probably have never seen a shipworm or never thought about what a shipworm is, but I can almost guarantee every one of you has seen something like this. If you walk on the beach, you see a log, especially here, you see logs or wood that's washed up, and it's just riddled full of holes. And you know they're not drilled by humans because they're all like wormy and like honeycombed all the way through. If you have seen this, you've seen the work of shipworms. Shipworms are not actually worms. They're actually a highly specialized group of bivalve mollusks. So they're a type of clam. Their main food source is woody plant tissue. So this is most like it's trees, it's wood. They're called shipworms, obviously, because they burrow into wood and they look like worms. They have really small shells for clams and they have a really long worm-like body, hence shipworm. So I often describe to you, people know what a clam looks like. So you imagine it's got the shells, and then on the posterior end, it has a siphon, which is kind of like the snorkel. And if you grab that shell part and you grab the siphon part and you just stretched it out, you'd actually approximate something like a shipworm. So you wind up with things like, these are the shells on the head end, sort of the anterior. And then it has this really long stretched out body, and the siphons are at the posterior end, like that. So this is how you get this really stretched out worm-like body form from something like a clam. Shipworms are related to other kinds of boring bivalves. They're sort of the ancestors. Shipworms are their own family called the Pteridinidae. But there's another group of bivalves called the pholads, or like Piddocks, or angel wings, that bore into rock or like hard mud or sandstone or wood. And clams burrow to find a place of escape. Like often they burrow into mud or sand. Some groups of clams, like Piddocks, learned how to bore into things like I said, soft rocks or wood or coral, to try and really protect themselves. It's from ancestors like these that shipworms evolved. So really specializing in wood and boring further and further into wood, and then taking advantage of it, not just as a habitat, but actually as a food source. I'll talk a little bit about that a little later. If you want to look closer at the anatomy of shipworms, the valves, the shells on the anterior end, if you look really, really closely at them, they're actually covered in cutting teeth. They're like the surface of a file. And these are a rasping surface that they use to mechanically wear away at wood. They're kind of like at the front end, a little bit like a little file or drill bit. They keep moving and moving and moving their shell valves. And they just rasp away at the wood. All those tiny little flecks of wood that's generated from that, they actually eat. And they store it in a big kind of gut pouch called a cecum. And there the wood gets broken down and they derive most of their nutrition from the wood, like termites do. It's very rare to actually have organisms that actually break down cellulose like that or lignin like that. Or usually takes a lot of other herbivores need a lot of digestion to do that. We'll talk a little bit more later about how shipworms actually achieve this. When shipworms burrow in, they kind of bore further and further and further in. And to protect themselves, they don't want anything coming in the burrow after them. They have something called pallets. at the posterior end, which are these kind of calcium-like, paddle-like calcium structures, and they use those to plug the entrance to their burrow. We'll discuss those a little more later. And as they burrow along, they line the tubes with calcium. So sometimes it looks like these really bizarre, like these logs you'll see that are, the shipworms have died, the log is broken open, and you see these sinuous tubes, they've got thin layers of calcium lined to it. It's just kind of truly bizarre, but these are all organically derived from shipworms. Most people, when they study mollusks, they think of like studying shells. And we look at things like the shell valves to identify, oh, this is this one species of clam versus this other species of clam. In shipworms, this doesn't work so well. So for example, all these are different different individuals. These are the shell valves at the front of the animal. To me, these look very, very different, like how much of the cutting face is there, the shape of this kind of posterior ear where one of the muscles is attached to, the size of them, except these are all the same species. They all come from the same species of shipworm. When your shells are actually used to like bore into the wood, the hardness of the wood and the age of the shipworm are going to change the shape of the shell valves and the nature of them. So they're no longer a very good character for identifying the different species. So a shipworm in softwood or very hardwood can actually have very different looking shell valves. And conversely here, to me, other than size, these are actually fairly similar looking shell valves, but these all belong to completely different genera of shipworms. So even within a species, they can be so different, and even between genera, they can look very, very similar. So when we try and understand or try and identify shipworms, we look on the other end of the animal. The pallets, these calcium-based like paddle-like structures, are the most reliable characters we have to identify them. Pallets, like I said, they're kind of paddle-like. They're made out of calcium. They have a stalk and then this kind of blunt end on the posterior end. And there are a lot of variation there. Some of them are segmented, like we see here. They have sort of multiple segments, or here too, multiple segments of these. These are both different species of a genus called Bankia. Others are single like plugs of calcium and then capped with a kind of a leathery top. This is made out of material called periostracum, which is often the kind of the leathery, sometimes brown like covering you see on some snails or some mollusks. So we study each shipworm has one pair of these pallets. Like I said, they close the burrow up with them. It stops predators going in after them. It also stops desiccation. So if the wood is exposed to the tide, they can plug up that entrance and they can survive with water in their tube, and they can survive there for multiple days. They're totally happy, all sealed up nice and tight. So this is kind of the main way we identify these things. There's about 70 species of shipworms worldwide, and we're still finding more all the time. We're actually looking in new places, and we're applying a lot more new techniques, or looking at what we thought was one species and actually is multiple different species based on like their genetics. So we keep finding more. This list keeps on growing. Shipworms were predominantly studied, and they're really interesting to humans because they cause serious damage to marine structures. This is a section through a wooden piling that was unprotected. And this piling is 12 months old. And like you're nearing the point of failure on this. Like this is we're approaching a very dangerous situation of like, you don't want this a dock being held up by this wooden piling. And shipworms can grow really, really quickly, and they'll bore into wood if it's unprotected, or if it's, it doesn't have, this is why you see so many docks here, they're coated in like tar, like it helps prevent shipworms from getting in. And they just bore their way through, they eat their way through, and just weaken the wood over time. It's interesting to note shipworms almost always go with the grain of the wood. So you see, this cross section is mostly holes. See a few, burrows as they're coming across the face of the shot, but most of them, they just bore along the wood. That's sort of the easiest for them to do. And the nasty thing about shipworms is they leave almost no external sign of damage. They're not really mobile. They settle down as a tiny, tiny little larva that's swimming like a barnacle does. They settle down, they start boring in, and then they're stuck in that piece of wood for the rest of their life. But it also means the entrance hole they leave is not much bigger than the larva that landed there. And they can get longer and longer and longer and bigger and bigger and bigger. And all they need is that tiny little hole at the entrance for their two little siphons to stick out so they can breathe, they can bring water in. And you can see now why this tiny little entrance hole, those pallets at the end can just plug that up. You're not getting in there after them. If you're a worm or a predator, you can't get in there, and they can plug that up and they can last, they prevent desiccation. They're snug there for a long time. But if there was a little bit of fouling on this wood, or a bit of seaweed, you might never know there's any shipworms in there. They don't broach the surface when they're burrowing. They're all internally. You may not know until the wood just completely collapses. Some species do get very, very large. This is a species that lives in mangroves in the Philippines and Papua New Guinea called Cuphis polythamia. Polythamia. And it bores into these big logs and mangrove swamps and actually just keeps on going through it. Just kind of goes on and on and on. And it leaves that calcium tube that it lines its burrow with. And you can find these, they're like a didgeridoo. They're heavy, they're solid. This is a big, heavy shipworm. Really kind of fascinating. And this is kind of the longest, either the longest and certainly the widest shipworm there is. And it's probably the most primitive. A lot of people think of shipworms obviously with ships, and they think, well, what about, we don't have any wooden ships anymore. Well, shipworms evolved because there are actually lots of natural wood sources in the marine environment. They're not common, but they do arise through storms, through tree falls and coasts, and mangrove forests. There's a small but steady supply of wood in the marine environment. Wood is a place to bore into. It's a resource that's not used very commonly in the marine environment. The ancestors of shipworms bored into wood or wood and soft rock to take advantage of it as a safe place. But shipworms took it one step further by boring into it and taking advantage of the cellulose. They break it down with the aid of symbiotic bacteria in their bodies. Cellulose is glucose. If you kind of have the effort in there, and especially with bacteria to help out, you can break that down and provide a decent energy source for them. So they have this free energy source that not many other animals in the marine environment ever use. And if it wasn't for shipworms, our oceans would get progressively littered with wood. There's not a lot of animals in freshwater that eat wood. So when you see flooded lakes, all lakes are flooded, but where a dam was, you see these drowned forests. There are trees standing in these forests that could be 20 years old. You wouldn't see that in the marine environment because shipworms would topple them way earlier. But in freshwater, we don't have many wood borers like that. So wood borers took advantage of this niche. There's always this wood in the marine environment. It's not super common, but it's there. And shipworms have a worldwide distribution. There's species found all around the world. But humans have undoubtedly played a role in spreading them around the world. We've increased the amount of habitat and we've increased their distributions. If you think of, there may have been a species with one particular range. For 500 years, we sailed wooden ships with varying levels of protection all around the world. And so we've probably distributed shipworms all around the world. And so even if you introduce them to certain areas, through natural dispersal, shipworms as moving via their larvae or floating wood, even if they're introduced into one or two different areas, they'll naturally wind up spreading out over the course of many years. So some species wind up today with truly cosmopolitan distributions. This is a species called Lyrotis pediculatus, but others like Charito nivalis, one of the most common shipworms, are almost found worldwide. And this is probably not a natural distribution. This is a human caused distribution. And I think it'd be really interesting to study more, how have these populations diverged now that we don't have wooden ships that much anymore. Shipworms are only subject to their natural distributions or their natural dispersal. Have Atlantic and Pacific populations diverged much? I think that'd be a really interesting question to ask. Shipworms, like I said, they cause really serious damage to unprotected wooden structures. And as long as humans have built wooden structures on or in the ocean, we have realized the damage they cause. The Greek philosopher and scientist Theophrastus described woods which decay in seawater are eaten by the teredo. And this is the Greek teredonos, which means to wear away at or to bore into. And so from this, the teredo is one of the most common genera of shipworms, and it's also a shorthand, so people call them teredos instead of shipworms. And that gives the name to the family. The Pteridinidae is the family of these. There's also even quite poetic, metaphorical uses of shipworms. Ovid was a Roman writer, and he was exiled to from Rome, exiled to the Black Sea, and he spent his life, the remainder of his life there, writing. And as he finished his final volume, he knew it would be his final volume. In the start of that, he wrote this long piece about how it was, he knew this big thing was coming to an end. And one of the metaphors he uses is, as a ship's hull is weakened by shipworms unseen, so my heart feels the gnawing of sorrow. So I think it's just like, wow, that's fantastic. And it also clearly means his audience who was reading this also knew this idea that, yeah, like ships are gnawed by shipworms. I like this is an interesting study from Holland, like people who were really invested in things like the integrity of their piles and pilings. This is, I believe, from the 1500s or 1600s in Holland. They call them pilworm or pile worms. And you can see, this is a piece of wood with all these very small little holes that you may not know, but you cut that wood open and lo and behold, it's full of shipworms. It's, this is a problem. This, I like it, mit kleine opening, with small openings that, that you may not know it, but inside these piles just get completely destroyed by shipworms. Well, people had to figure out ways to stop this. So even in the ancient world, there are remedies that were used. A common one is tar-like substances like pitch and bitumen mixed with oils or chemicals like sulfur to coat the wood. And this is still, using tar or bitumen is still a common way of impregnating the wood, and tends to kill off the larvae before they can settle it in there. And there's references to this that go back thousands of years. In the Bible, the instruction to Noah was make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. That's not just waterproofing, that's probably a reference to make it shipworm proof. I always wonder, were there two shipworms boring into the ark as well? Or in Homer's Odyssey, he uses a lot of colorful metaphors, but a lot of the time they talk about black ships. Let's draw a black ship down to the bright sea. A lot of these ships were coated with pitch or coated with tar at the time, again, to provide a little bit of waterproofing, but also to lengthen their lifespan against things like shipworms. These accounts continued for hundreds of years. You can find references to this. Columbus's fourth voyage, he did multiple trips to the New World. His fourth voyage wound up in the Caribbean and basically lost almost all his ships. This quote, describes how disastrous it was. In a storm, the ship started falling apart, rotten, worm-eaten, more riddled with holes than a honeycomb. 3 pumps, pots, and kettles, all the hands working. They could not keep down the water which came into the ship, and there was no other remedy for the havoc which the worm had wrought. My ship was sinking under me. And in Captain Cook's log, after he'd come through the Coral Sea, they were putting in for repairs in Indonesia, and describes part of the bottom of the vessel was thinner than the sole of a shoe. Linnaeus, in cataloging, he described Teredo nivalis as I don't remember how many species of shipworm he named, but he described Teredo nivalis, the borer of ships, but described it as calamitas navium, which is the bane of ships. So you have to take these threats seriously. Columbus certainly learned the lesson. I also like this poem by Henry David Thoreau, using shipworms as, again, a metaphor for fate. The vessel, though her masts be firm, beneath her copper bears a worm. And I'll move forward a little bit. Far from New England's blustering shore, New England's worm her hulk shall bore. So, you might try and outrun fate, but fate will catch up to you. You might travel away, but you still have a shipworm in your hull that'll just keep on boring and boring and boring. It's not all bad. Shipworms are used as a food source. by humans. Mostly I know of is in Papua New Guinea, Australia, and the Philippines. There's describing, in the Philippines, they call them tamalak. There's lots of names in Australia, cobra, cambo, lachin. There's this very evocative piece written in 1857 that talks about breaking open a log and these glistening, gleaming worms inside, and hold it between finger and thumb as a Neapolitan would a piece of macaroni and allow it to gently slide down. So we're a little squeamish about things like worm, eating worm-like things, but I think they're due for a public opinion or a boost. If we call them something like long oysters, people would be like, oh yeah, that sounds good, long oysters. But shipworms, people don't like that idea. So I'll talk a little more about their biology here. So they clearly set up the historical context and like why they're interesting. I'll talk a little more about their anatomy and their biology. As I mentioned, shipworms start off life as a little tiny swimming larva, maybe about 1/4 of a millimeter in size. They swim through the water like most bivalve larvae do, and they are smelling for wood. They can pick up the cues of wood. We still don't know actually what in particular they smell, but what cue they use. But they find wood and they settle down, and they start boring into it. They start getting little more teeth on their shells. They bore in, and then they start. Basically, the posterior end stays where they bored in, and the anterior end just keeps on growing. So they get longer and longer and longer and longer, and here that worm-like shape emerges. And they usually, like I said, they usually bore along the wood grain. I love this illustration of like a cross section as they kind of bore in and kind of get longer and longer and longer. But this could also be a real situation of different size shipworms arriving at different times. Shipworms only have one burrow, and remarkably, they never intersect each other. They know somehow. I wonder if it's like knocking on a drywall to find the studs. As this one gets close, it realizes the wood's getting thinner, and it's like, oh, I'm coming up against another one. I'm going to go this way. Or similarly here, they also don't run into the end of the wood. They might bore along, but as they approach the end of the wood, they turn around and they change direction and they keep on boring. Or sometimes they'll bore along and they'll arrive at a knot and it's too difficult, and they'll kind of back out again, and they'll wall off the burrow, and then they'll go in a different direction. It's really quite remarkable. They just keep on boring and boring and boring. But as they keep on growing, they are truly stuck in the wood. The entrance hole where the siphons come out is much smaller than the rest of them. They can't back out. They have almost no muscles in their long body. They're really just attached at the front end. Their foot holds on and allows them to bore. They couldn't leave if they wanted to. So this is the catch for shipworms, is that once you settle there, you're stuck there, and you got to make the most of it while you're there. And as you're boring into it, you are actually like lowering the lifespan of that wood. So this leads to some really interesting like ecological questions, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So it's in shipworms' interest to find more wood through reproduction once their mature species reproduce. And they can do this in various ways, depending on the species. Some of them are free spawning. They produce eggs or sperm. Shipworms are hermaphrodites, but they're sequential hermaphrodites. So they're male, and then when they get a little larger, they switch to becoming female. This makes sense to me because you want a larger body to produce lots and lots of eggs. You don't have to be very large to produce lots and lots of sperm. So they fertilize, like they spawn eggs and sperm, they fertilize the eggs, the larvae drift off, go through all the development. It takes almost a month for them to then be ready to settle down again. Other shipworms hold on to the fertilized eggs in their gills and actually brood, which I think this is really very unusual in mollusks and in bivalves. They actually brood their young. Some of them are short-term brooders. They hold on to them until they're kind of like half baked, There's two different main phases of bivalve larvae, a D larvae and then a pedovillager. They hold on to this D larva stage, and then they release them. And it takes about 2 weeks before they're ready to settle down. Other species brood the larvae for a long time until they're like a fully grown pedovillager, release them, and then they're ready to settle down in only a couple days. So there's these different strategies for how they're going to like send out their offspring. But there can be very fecund. In studying them, I had a specimen that was 10 centimeters long, and I took out its gonads, which is not a very nice thing to do, but through like subsampling the gonads, I estimated that this 10 centimeter long Bankia canara could release 1 million eggs in one go. Like, so that's very, very fecund. So casting those out to hopefully find another piece of wood to settle back down again. This is another like kind of view of these different strategies, sort of the spawning, the short-term brooding, and the long-term brooding, releasing their eggs that develop through all these typical bivalve stages until they're ready to settle down in the wood. Of course, this is not scale. This is just like enlarged for your view of these little pedovillagers that actually, as they swim and they land, they have a little foot, they can crawl around, they can sniff, they can decide if they want to settle there or not, they can swim off again. But once they start boring, you've kind of committed to that piece of wood. You're stuck there for the rest of your life, or the life of the wood, which is also like your life as well. Interestingly, most shipworms are spawners. They release eggs and sperm. But the larval brooders kind of have emerged or evolved kind of once, mostly in the genera Lyrotis and Teredo. There's another genus called Zaxia, which we think broods as well, but we don't really know. Mostly, these other genera are tropical and not so common. And these all have these solid pallets that are kind of made of single pieces of calcium. These ones also, yeah, the brooding is only in like I said, only in Lyrotis and Teredo. The other main lineage are ones with segmented pallets, including Bankia, which is another common genus. And you can see these pallets all have kind of segments of some kind. They grow in like sequences. So if you do see something that has segmented pallets, at least you know that that is a spawner, that it releases eggs and sperm. The conditions that shipworms can grow in are interesting. Shipworms are found on every continent of the world except Antarctica. In Antarctica, I don't know if it's too cold, but it's probably that there's no trees. Shipworms can handle quite cold water, but they're not usually found in the poles. It's probably just a little too cold, but also there's just not enough wood to support a population of them. This is why we found the Endurance, like thousands of meters down under the ice in the Antarctic like a few weeks ago. And other than being crushed by ice, the whole stern of it looks pretty pristine. It would be a very different story if it was warmer water or in a higher latitude or a different latitude that shipworms could live in. It would really like break down that kind of that wood. So you don't find them in those kind of areas. Different species tend to have temperature preferences. They tend to live in temperate areas, or they prefer subtropical areas, or they're tropical areas. You kind of break down most species of those. There are a few that have a much greater temperature range, and those are the ones that tend to be a little better at being cosmopolitan species. In warmer water, like in the tropics, reproduction, settlement, and growth is much more severe because they can grow and reproduce and settle all year round. I was doing my research in the north of Australia, and I found I had shipworms just settling down all through the year, and just would just really quickly get settled and attacked and just start falling apart. In temperate waters like BC, the life cycle is mostly restricted to the warmer months. So the adults will keep on living through the winter, but their growth slows down a little, their feeding slows down a little, and they wait till summertime, and that's when their reproduction tends to happen. This is when they'll when they'll spawn. And although the reproduction is limited by that temperature, adults will keep on living for years. And adults are a lot more hardy. So there are real world cases of, I believe, when they filmed Mutiny on the Bounty, they built a replica ship, and it wasn't perfectly shipworm proofed. And when they brought it back to New York for an overhaul, they still had living subtropical shipworms from where they filmed it, like in the Caribbean, living in the hull, that were like living in New York Harbor now in the winter, because the adults were hardy enough, but the larvae wouldn't have survived. So that's kind of the weak link, is things like the larvae. The adults will kind of keep on going, or the adults are very, very hardy. Salinity is also something that really restricts a lot of them. Shipworms are mostly marine, and the typical marine salinity is about 30 parts per thousand. But like I said, shipworms are very, very hardy. At least the adults are very hardy. They can survive very low salinity and very high salinity for extended periods of time. Also, like I said, desiccation. A shipworm is living in a floating log. That log can wash up and be there for a few days, and the shipworm is still living inside it with the hole plugged, and they're living that little thing of water, and they're just hoping the tide comes back in. Or even in a piling, they can live above the tide line, or bore in above the tide line and then grow down or up. And then when the water comes back up again to cover the entrance to their burrow, they can unplug it, start breathing again, and they're content. And then every time the tide goes down, they just plug it back up again. The larvae are, again, the weak link here. Larvae are very sensitive to low salinities. So one thing, you may not be able to kill off some of the adults, but this is why we store logs at river mouths, like the entrance to the Fraser River, is the salinity is too low for shipworms to settle on them. That's why all these big long brooms are there. They won't get attacked by shipworms. You don't want shipworms in wood that's going to be used for timber, because, well, A, it destroys the strength of it. It destroys you don't want holes, like aesthetically, but also even just the calcium that lines those tubes is enough to blunt saw blades over time. Like, you don't want it in your sawmill. This being said, there are some tropical species that thrive in low salinities, like quite low, 10 parts per thousand. There's one genus called Nossatora that is infamous for living in brackish habitats and can grow really quite large. There are cases in Australia in the 20s when people were just like, oh, yep, this is basically a freshwater, lake that has some tidal ingress in it, and we don't need to put, don't need to put tar on this bridge. And after a few years, someone was driving a truck across it in the 1920s, and the bridge collapsed because Nossatora just bored all the way through it, and people didn't think to study that. There's also another unusual species, which I'll talk about later in one slide, that has been discovered in a river that's living entirely in freshwater with a little bit of salt water, I think. But that's also really, really unusual. And it's a very un-shipworm-like shipworm. In BC, I have to have some local angle here. There's only one species sort of truly native to BC, and this is called Bankia cetacea. Sometimes this gets referred to as the feathery shipworm, or the giant feathery shipworm. It can grow really quite large. Here's one that's almost a centimeter in width at its widest. Some can grow up to 1 meter long. And so, over years and years and years, they grow really long, really quite large. Very, very fecund. They mostly reproduce in the summer, and then settlement peaks in the kind of late summer, early fall, as those larvae come back down again. We do have occasionally other species here, but they're quite rare, and they haven't really taken a foothold. They're not that common. So if you see something, it's probably Bankia cetacea, and it's very, very familiar, very easy to recognize. If it's out of the wood, it has these very long, very segmented, feathery looking pallets. I'm biased. I think shipworms are fascinating. Shipworms are really interesting from research perspective. Obviously, research into how to protect wood against shipworms has been really, really important. We do have very good ways of protecting wood now. We using modern wood treatments or just building boats out of metal tends to reduce the impact that shipworms have. But there's a new interest in looking at shipworms from other perspectives as well, like looking at shipworms from an ecological perspective. If you think about it, shipworms have a really extreme niche. They have a very, very specific substrate. Like they can only live in wood. Like they could bore into plastic, but they can't eat plastic, so they would starve to death. So they can only survive in wood. Wood is not common in the marine environment, so it's very patchy. This is kind of an interesting, like, ecological term we use. Like it's not distributed in like large abundances, and so you might have a log here, and you might have a log over there. Like it's in discrete little areas, and because shipworms bore into wood, eventually wood in the marine environment, is going to be destroyed. So these communities are ephemeral as well. They're not just uncommon, they're short-lived. They might only be there for a few years, or in some cases, like a few months. The wood could be carried away, it could be washed up, or it could be completely eaten. Shipworms, like I said, bore into the wood, and they're truly stuck there. They're really now stuck within this piece of wood. And there may be multiple species of shipworms in this piece of wood. And there could be hundreds or thousands of individuals in this piece of wood. So there's competition between and within species. All species compete for resources. For shipworms, they're competing for space and they're competing for food, which is the same thing for them, really. It's real estate inside this wood. So they're incentivized to be able to settle down and grow and reproduce quickly and grow quickly, because you don't know how long this wood is going to last. When you're a tiny larva, are you settling on a piece of wood this big, or are you settling on a piece of wood this big? You have no idea. So you kind of have to hedge your bets a bit. You have to be prepared to grow fast and be ready to reproduce, because you're not leaving that wood, but your offspring will. So this makes them a really interesting model for things like community ecology, because every piece of wood is a different community that's linked by dispersal. And not theirs, but their larvae. So they can't leave. So it's up to their larvae to find another piece of wood. There can be multiple different species living in this. One shipworm or a couple shipworms in a piece of wood might be perfectly happy, but what if now there's hundreds or thousands? Now it's getting really crowded. Now you have to have that drive to grow and reproduce really quickly. It's really interesting for studying things like competition and coexistence and strategies of how shipworms adapt to these kind of situations. So in my PhD research, I was based at James Cook University in Townsville in tropical Australia. And I was interested in studying, like, how do shipworms settle throughout the year? What are the abundances? What are different kinds of species? How does that vary across the year? How can we compare and contrast, like, the different kinds of shipworms that meet, like, what success do they meet, basically? So I designed these wooden panels for studying shipworms. They're made out of radiata pine, and it's made out of 2mm pine veneer. Before the veneer would be glued together, I just got the sheets, and I cut 6 pieces of veneer, and I bolted them together between pieces of plexiglass. And this leaves room on the outside for shipworms to settle down and grow in. But it also acts like a single, like, solid piece of wood, but it means I could also take the bolts and plexiglass off, and it was much easier to then take apart that wood to retrieve whole intact shipworms, rather than trying to, like, carve open the wood. And they can kind of bore around each other in every which way, and it's really hard to get them out intact otherwise. That being said, I collected these for 12 months, and it probably took me 2 years to get all of them out of the wood. And I wound up with 62,000 shipworms and I counted all of them, and I photographed all of them, and I measured all of them. I don't recommend it. I should have done a pilot study. I had way too many shipworms. Actually, because I had the measurements of them, I figured that if you took all of them end to end, it'd actually be the height of the Empire State Building. It's a fun little fact. But one of the things I found was that we can look at abundances of the kind of the species that show up, and we can split them into things like brooding and spawning. You don't have to focus on, these were different sites I had. This is a way of expressing like abundances. Spawning species are the majority of diversity. Almost 60% of the species that show up are spawners, but they're only 4% of the abundance. Most of the individuals encountered are brooders. So there's less species of brooders, but they're much, much more abundant. And this makes it's interesting. It's interesting to think why. Why is this the case? Well, I think reproductive mode, we go back to like those different strategies, strongly determines success of recruitment. The lifestyle of shipworms, like when they're stuck in this wood and they're looking for more wood for their offspring to find, you have to be able to balance multiple things. You have to balance fecundity, you have to balance retention of larvae in an area, and dispersal of larvae. So if you're in a piece of wood, maybe you want your larvae to come back and settle in that piece of wood. That you know you have a piece of habitat there, but you don't know how big that piece of wood is. And if all of your offspring come back there, the wood is going to fall apart sooner, you're all going to die, and you've got none of your offspring have gone to find new pieces of wood. And dispersal is the other catch too, of like, well, how far can you send your larvae out? You want to balance all these kind of things. The spawning species have high fecundity and high dispersal, but very poor retention. Those larvae are going to be, they need 30 days to develop. So they're going to be off and carried away by the ocean much, much further before they're ready to settle down. So I think they're much better at finding like, oh, I found a piece of wood. Okay, good. I'm going to grow. They also tend to grow much larger. So I'm going to grow larger. I'm going to produce millions and millions of eggs in the hope that I'm going to find another foothold over here and over here and over here. The brooders have those shorter life cycles because their larvae can settle back down sooner. So once brooders are established in an area, it's much more likely that their larvae are going to kind of be able to settle down. They're in the same bay or the same area. That's good, but they're not able to last as long or travel as far. If your larvae are only going to live for a couple days, that's great if you want to settle back down the same piece of wood. But what if there's no more wood in this area? It's much, much harder for your offspring to go off further distances to find new habitats. So with this in mind, that short-term brooding is kind of the middle of the road strategy. And these were the most abundant species, ones that had that mix of 2 weeks of time in the water. They don't produce, they don't produce as many eggs, or as the spawners do. They have, but there's more of them than the fewer, larger, long-term brooders. And the short, that 2-week lifespan of the larvae takes before they're ready to settle down is a nice mix of, some of them will be retained locally and can settle down. Others can be carried away and find new habitats. It's kind of this mix of this balance that each of these different species, even each of these different life history strategies has some kind of advantage, but that plays out in their different abundances. I'll talk just near the end here. I'll talk about, we're still discovering all sorts of new interesting things about shipworms. I have a colleague, Ruben Shipway, which is a great name for somebody who studies shipworms, Shipway. He has just been knocking it out of the park. He has been finding all sorts of really, really cool stuff lately. And a couple of years ago, he and his colleagues in the Philippines were tipped off that there was something growing in rocks in the bottom of a river in the Philippines. So they went there, I don't know what, some worm boring in rocks. Lo and behold, This is a shipworm that no longer bores into wood. It's kind of reverted to its ancestral state. It bores into rock. It survives on plankton. It lives in these bottoms of these rivers, which on itself is also really unusual for shipworms, being such a freshwater environment. But it's bores into sandstone. It kind of blows the mind. Instead of ingesting all the wood fragments, it actually ingests some of the sand grains. It poops out sand. Because they're interested in studying, like, does it actually gain any nutrition from these sandstone? It's porous enough that, you know, is there bacteria in there that they can like digest? Do they get any minerals from it? We don't know. This is a really, really bizarre shipworm. So they call it lithurido, like, so, you know, a rock borer, a rock boring shipworm. Just truly, truly bizarre. And also, there's been some major breakthroughs recently. We know shipworms eat wood. We know shipworms have symbiotic bacteria like termites that help them digest that. But up until a couple of years ago, until last year, we actually didn't have an understanding of how shipworms actually achieved that, because the bacteria that shipworms have that produce enzymes live in their gills. And where the wood is actually in their digestive system. And we didn't have any idea of the pathway that shipworms got those enzymes into their digestive system. I won't take you through this, but this is a really interesting finding, that they were able to use some of the same kind of bivalve anatomy that would normally be used for passing plankton to their gut, to pass the enzymes and even some of the bacteria into their gut, where it's ground up and then sent to their gut pouch, the cecum, where it then breaks down all those cellulose fibers into glucose and provides nutrition for these shipworms. And like I said, we are still discovering new species. This was a little while ago, but part of my PhD research, I had the chance to discover a new shipworm. It showed up in my settlement panels. I didn't know what it was. I went down to the Australian Museum and looked through their collections, and lo and behold, here was the same thing, but also undescribed. I don't have my book with me. There was a woman named Ruth Turner, who was one of the first, if not the first, female curator at the Museum of Comparative Zoology in Harvard, one of the first women with tenure at Harvard. Ruth Turner was the world expert on shipworms. And in the 60s, she went through and basically looked at every museum's collection of shipworms, and she was the one who hit upon the idea that, no, you cannot study the shell valves, you have to look at the pallets. And she cut down the number of species in the world from like 360 down to 60, because everyone was looking at these different variations in shells and describing all sorts of new species everywhere. And she said, no, look at the pallets, that's the only meaningful character. And she had found the species on a trip to Australia, but never got around to describing it. So I had the opportunity to name it after her, Lyrodis turneri, in recognition of her. She passed away in the late 90s, but anyone who works on shipworms still like stands on her shoulders. She was like the foundation of what we consider like modern studies of like our understanding of shipworm diversity. And I've probably just barreled through that, but that's not all I have to say or can say about shipworms, but I'm actually happy to leave it there. So I'll leave you with more pictures of their handiwork and a $20,000 guitar that someone made out of shipworm wood. So it's not entirely useless for our purposes. But I'll say thank you very much, and I'll open the floor to any questions you have.
Great, thank you very much, Hugh. Excellent. Fascinating creatures. So does anybody have a question? You can either unmute yourself and ask it directly, or you can put it in the chat. I was wondering, maybe I'll start off, Hugh. They have siphon at the tail end. Do they actually do any filter feeding with that? That part of their anatomy?
Yeah, so they have they have the siphons, and they bring water in, and just like other bivalves, it goes over their gills and then comes out the other siphon. They do eat and capture plankton. It's been a real debate as to what role that plays.
Right.
if people have grown them in very like with no plankton, and they don't grow as well. So they take what they can get. I think they supplement their diet with it. I didn't mention they also have another set of bacteria in them that helps fix nitrogen, kind of like what's in bean nodules. So they can actually fix nitrogen from the water and add that to their systems as well. But yes, the short answer is they do filter feed. They don't have to filter feed so much. Most of their nutrition is coming from the wood, but there are lots of amino acids and things that wood doesn't contain. So they're getting that from things like from the plankton, from filter feeding, and they're only really getting that from planktonic algae, like little microalgae.
Okay. Looks like Don Kramer has a question.
Is there any indication of specialization on different wood species or avoidance of some of the highly protected woods like cedars?
That's an excellent question. Yes, there's definitely some woods that are resistant. For shipworms, it tends to be woods that have lots of chemicals in them, or lots and lots of silica, like a high silica content. There's something like Norfolk Island pine, or some woods in Tasmania. Like there's some species that were very in demand for use in building timber structures elsewhere around the world because they're naturally quite resistant to shipworms. I don't know how resistant cedar is on its own. Sometimes wood is also resistant for a while, but as it gets more waterlogged and any chemicals that it has kind of leach out, it now becomes less shipworm proof. So, it might be long for a shipworm's lifespan, but in terms of like wooden infrastructure, if it, 10 years could be a short time, like it might take 10 years, but it'll start getting attacked by shipworms. And then you can't rely on that enough. In terms of preferring, no, they seem to take what they can get. And it's either they can't differentiate. Even woods they can't survive in, they'll tend to just try and settle down and try and grow and then die. So they're probably smelling something that's common to all woods. Interestingly enough, they also settle on some things that aren't wood. In the days of the early days of transoceanic telegraph wires were wrapped in something called gutta percha. We didn't have rubber, synthetic rubber, or even like modern rubber. So gutta percha was also derived from a tree sap from Indonesia that was used to coat these. And something about gutta percha is kind of raw enough that it smells enough like wood to shipworms, and shipworms will bore into gutta percha wrapped telegraph cables and eventually cause shorts or damage to them. So that's something, again, that they're boring in, they're not getting much nutrition or any nutrition, but they can kind of last for a while or just start weakening it. There's something about that they smell. They're not really preferring other kinds. So it's something common to a lot of other woods. There's a couple exceptions. I say most shipworms, kind of beggars can't be choosers. Like wood is rare enough that if you find something, you're not going to go, I'm going to wait for something better. They're going to try and settle down. A few species are very specific. There's a genus called Euperotus that we only find in floating nuts like coconuts, which, like, how rarer are coconuts as opposed to just like wood. And then there's another genus called Zaxia that only lives in the rhizomes, so roots of seagrasses. And you never know it's there. It just like settles down and bores along. And it kind of runs out of room. It just one lives in one rhizome, mostly in the Indo-Pacific, kind of like Madagascar areas, like one shipworm to one rhizome. And they even then have, they need to reproduce. So they have dwarf males that live in the female that provide them with sperm. So yes, that's my long and short of answer. Yes, there's some woods that are very resistant, but shipworms still try, they just fail. And there's very few preferences in terms of wood.
So First Nations canoes may have been not protected particularly because they were cedar, but because they were pulled out of the water for longer periods of time, perhaps.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah, so wood would have to be in water for a while before it gets attacked enough. So if wood is standing or in water for long periods of time, that's going to be attacked. And if you leave it out for long enough, the shipworms in it will die. There's some debate about, it was very common in the Greek and Roman era for like to take a trireme, you know, and or your rowing ship and to beach them every night. And some people think that was just because they didn't have anchorages. Some people think it was a way of like letting just prevent shipworms or to dry the hull out a little, like if it was full of shipworm burrows, alive or dead, to kind of like let it dry out a little bit more. I'm not entirely sure what the right answer to that is.
Okay, thank you. Interesting answer and interesting talk.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, Hugh, there's a bunch on the chat here. I'll just read some of them out. One from Danica Gleave. She's curious about how you can tell if a piece of wood full of holes still has live animals in it or not. Or can you?
when you see the wood like that's really like worn away and you can see the burrows, you know now that they're probably dead. That's when it's been broken open and basically everything in there has died.
Mhm.
If it's just a piece of wood, it's really difficult to tell. I have only ever found that by if the wood was quite wet, like you can, if you look at the little pinprick holes, you can see sometimes the actual pallets being like that little hole, you can see the pallets plugging it. Or if there's a bit of a hole and you like stick a little pin or something through, you'll see the pallets come through and they'll plug it. So that's kind of the only way that I know of to tell if there are actually any live in there. Usually if I'm just looking, I just take a piece of wood and I try and break it open, or I start ripping it open or tearing it open and see if I can find live ones inside it to then extract them. But that's part of the danger of shipworms, is that you don't know how many are in a piece of wood unless you look really closely for the burrow holes. And even then, don't know how many there are. But yeah, great question.
The next question, Carolyn Reddle, does more than one species bore in the same wood?
Yes, definitely. So around here, we only really have the one species. But like I said, when I was in Australia, there were well over a dozen species in the same area. And so in the pine panels that I had 10 or 12 species in the same piece of wood at one time. So that's a lot of competition for space there, not just between members of the same species, but also different species as well. So you have all these different competition going on. That's why it was interesting and able to compare. Normally when you try and compare animals, they're either in different habitats or they have different biologies. Like if you're trying to compare how mussels and barnacles, they might live in the same area, but how does one succeed and the other one not? Well, there's a lot of natural difference between a mussel's physiology and a barnacle's physiology. But different species of shipworm are basically like identical, except for they're very, very similar, but they have these major, like meaningful differences that they've chosen, not chosen, but they've evolved to have, like different reproductive strategies. So it's much easier to compare them directly. Like they're, for all intents and purposes, are the same, except for how they decide to invest their resources in growth, or are they going to invest the same amount of energy into 1 million eggs or 10,000 large larvae. So that's why I find it really interesting, because there were multiple species at the same piece of wood, you can actually directly compare their chances of success and relate that to how they're growing and how they're reproducing. Good question, thank you.
Right. Following along, why do they line the tunnels with calcium?
That's a really good question. I don't actually know that. It's a very thin layer. On the bottom of the screen, the bottom right here, you can see a piece of wood that's broken open, and you can see the white in some of the tubes there. It's really quite thin. I don't know. It could be It stops the wood deteriorating a little more, or fungus from getting at it. It could be if the wood is broken open a little, it still provides a bit of a barrier. They can lay down more of it. I know they do. Can I zoom in here? I can't zoom in, but I can use my pen. It's hard to tell on here, but none of these have, I'm confident none of these have actually hit each other. But you can see, is it that one there? It's like, it's walled off. It's gone this far and walled it off maybe, and then it's going to try go somewhere else. Or here, there's a little bit of calcium there. That one was boring through here, and another one probably came up next to it and went along this way. They can kind of burrow for a bit and then back out and then try to go a different direction. They can go very close to each other. I'm gonna clear these. It's only on slide. Like this one here and this one here are very, very close. They only have a little bit area in between.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be that even if they get very, very close, just that little bit of calcium stops them by breaking into one burrow or the other. I don't know. That's just speculation. That's a great question.
Yeah. Okay, and Eric Kolb says, is there any fossil evidence as to their evolutionary age?
Also a good question. I believe the earliest fossils we have are Jurassic. Obviously, it's kind of tied to the age of their ancestors, the other kind of boring bivalve, like rock boring bivalves or burrowing bivalves. A lot of burrowing didn't really take off until kind of later. I believe they go back to the Jurassic. Also depends on the amount of like actually woody plant tissue that's around. But there were definitely like hard like trees before there were angiosperms, like lots of these conifers and were food sources. It's trickier to go back than that because paleontologists tend to describe sinuous tubes, like sinuous burrows, as what they call teratolites or teratolites. I'm not teratolites as this like that's a fossil taxon based on the burrow shape. But we don't exactly know what creates them all. Sometimes people say, "Oh, we found teratolites here," but it doesn't necessarily. It's not necessarily in a piece of fossilized wood. So was it actually a shipworm who created that? Sometimes we do find fossilized wood that is very old and it has preserved like shipworm shells or pallets in that. Then we can like, has a very definitive saying of like, yes, I know what that is. But just because there are shipworm shaped burrows that go back earlier than that, we don't exactly know that it's caused by shipworms.
Mm.
So that's the kind of the best I can do.
Okay. Michael Rogers says, you said they line their burrows with calcium. I presume that's calcium carbonate. So is it calcite or aragonite?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't remember.
Because clamshells are aragonite, I think.
Yes,
right?
I think it's aragonite because it is laid down from the mantle. It's not, it can be quite smooth and it is laid down in little layers. I think it's aragonitic. Yeah, because of the way it has these kind of like lamellar. Yeah, I think it's aragonite. But I can't confirm that for you. That's a great question.
Okay, here's another one. Ann Gunn says, do the different species prefer particular wood, tree species, or age of immersion, for example?
I talked about the different woods they didn't tend to prefer. I will say they will do better in some woods, so they might still settle in, and a shipworm that settles into a piece of oak and a piece of pine at the same time, the one in the pine will grow larger and faster, much larger faster, because it's much easier for it to bore and burrow, and it can ingest more. just because the denser wood doesn't give it more energy density. So in hindsight, they would probably prefer that. They're going, boy, this is easy, and it's go all the way through. But they don't seem to prefer it in terms of like sniffing out for a particular species. One thing I really wanted to do in my PhD was actually do tests like that, and I'm trying to work out what the chemical cue they use. You can do neat tests with have a little Y-shaped maze with like 2 different kinds of wood and water flowing very slowly, and put some larvae here and see which way they choose, or put them in a petri dish and let them go to one side or another.
Yeah.
And that was my plan for the last couple of years of my PhD, but it took me 2 years just to collect the data for that first chapter of counting 60,000 shipworms, and so I ran out of time. So I basically what else can I do and study the shipworms I do have, and I wasn't able to work on the chemical cue part. I think that'll be interesting. Like, if you gave larvae a choice, would they prefer wood that has no shipworms in it, or wood that has some shipworms in it, or would they not care? Like, if wood has shipworms in it, does that mean it's a good place to live, that it's supporting other shipworms, or does that mean it's going to fall apart faster, or it's going to be more crowded? But they also need someone to mate with, for a bit of time. So they want to. So these are questions that we really don't know. So I think that kind of stuff would be really interesting to understand.
Right. You may have already answered this one from Rand Harrison. Log booms in the Fraser River, are they protected by the decreased salinity?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And so if there were, shipworms can live in lower salinity, but if you had a log that was full of shipworms that washed into the North Arm or something, they could probably survive for a little while in lower salinity, because those adults are quite hardy, but they would reproduce and their larvae would die. They wouldn't be able to survive. The larvae, they're just small little tiny larvae. So keeping logs in these like river mouths stops larvae from settling in. Also, just the flow of the water, often the larvae can't swim against that current.
Right.
But that and the lower salinity means it's a safe place to store them. And even if just moving log booms through the ocean, it's not long enough to make a meaningful difference. Like, even if a shipworm started settling down, it would be, a few weeks or months before it became like that long, very, very, very long enough to cause any kind of damage to the wood. I will also say that's all. Shipworms don't tend to like bark so much. I don't know if it's the tannins or just the nature of the tough nature of the bark, but wood that's stripped of bark tends to be attacked a lot faster, or areas where the bark is scraped off, the shipworms tend to bore in there much more readily.
Right. Jeannie Cosgrove says you might like to mention that gribbles also leave trails on the surfaces of the wood under the bark.
Yes. So shipworms have competition. There are other wood-eating organisms in the marine environment. Gribbles are a type of isopod. I think they're spermatids isopods. They are like termites, and they don't bore into the wood, but they kind of go along the top of it, and they kind of make little trenches or little channels, and they kind of go munch, 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 munch. And they, like shipworms, break up the wood into little tiny fibers. They ingest that, and also like termites and shipworms have bacteria to help break that down and provide nutrition. So wood that's not really broken up and that has lots of little trenches or channels or little trails, that is often caused by by gribbles. Wait, no, they're limnorids, not spermatids. They're limnorids is the family.
All right.
Limnoria is a common genus of them. And they kind of munch along, but they don't tend to burrow in. They just kind of run along the surface. But over time, that really kind of wears away at stuff. So you'll find the surface of it getting kind of spongy and soft.
Let's see, Rand Harrison, there's another question. Is there any record of shipworm borings in First Nations canoes that you know of?
I don't know of anything. I'd love to hear of I'd love to hear some like indigenous knowledge in this area of like what people knew of shipworms. I don't even know any traditional names for them here. That's something I would actually really like to rectify. I think it'd be fascinating to hear more stories of that. I think with canoes, it's less of an issue because they would be left out of the water. And you leave it out long enough, the shipworms in it will die. Or if it's in the water for a while, it's not long enough for larvae to settle down and do any meaningful damage. So I don't think it's an issue for canoes. It would be if something was in the water for a long time or standing structures that tend to get damaged.
Okay, so one more question from another one from Don Kramer. For the external spawners, is anything known about how they synchronize their egg and sperm release?
Good question. That's a tricky one for shipworms because a shipworm that's the first one in the wood may not actually have any mates there at all. They'll try and release those eggs and hope they get fertilized, but like with most other animals in the marine environment that are broadcast spawners, the chances of fertilization success go down dramatically, like just even a few centimeters from where the eggs are released. Over a meter away, there's almost no chance that they're going to get fertilized. So yes, they do tend to need some kind of cue. They don't do mass spawning events, but I think when there's enough in the wood, I believe they're probably sniffing out, like if they detect sperm in the water, they release eggs or vice versa. If they're really close to each other, and I know this was studied with Bankia carinata, the species, Bankia cetacea that lives here, their siphons are really long, and if they live next to each other, almost like barnacles, they will fertilize each other. One will send its siphon over, a male will send its siphon over and find the incurrent siphon of a female and put it inside and then release sperm. So that actually fertilization is then actually happening internally, and then they release all the eggs. And this can actually get really raucous, like they're kind of wrapping around each other and they're fighting off another male to get to a female. My colleague Ruben Shipway and another colleague in Oregon were keeping some in wood in an aquarium for an unrelated project, and just happened to notice this. And they filmed it and wrote a paper on this behavior of like mate competition in shipworms, just all external to the wood, just using these long stretchy siphons. And I think it got written up in the New York Times, and I think it was called like the Shipworm sex tapes or something. So if you look on that, you'll see one way definitely of like increasing their chance of success is like by actually like physically going over and finding their neighbor and passing sperm from one to another.
Great. Okay, we got somebody says, oh, Danica says, thank you so much. Was excited to learn about shipworms, and you have exceeded my expectations.
Yeah, well, expectations are often very low when you come to learn about shipworms. Yeah, so it's my pleasure, and I think everyone should have something that they're something obscure that they're very excited about. And if I can tell my personal story,
sure.
I was an undergrad student at Bamfield Marine Science Station in 2005. And we were doing a field trip in Grappler Inlet, which is like we were studying soft sediment environments.
Mm-hmm.
And it was low tide, and the mud was like knee deep, and it was sticky, and it was so fun, but it was hard going. And I stood on this log that was like half buried in the mud at low tide, and I had it's all black with like kind of this kind of small like anoxic mud.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a shovel in my hand, and I just put the shovel down, not in frustration, but it's kind of like on the side of the log, and this big chunk of the log just came away, and from this outside was all black and muddy, and then the inside was this like golden color of the pine, and then these just glistening white shining fat, like as thick as your finger, shipworms inside it. And it just blew my mind. It's like, what on earth is that? Like, I have never seen anything like what could be surviving here, like inside this log, living down on this, like in this mud. So as you're encouraged to do in Bamfield, you're allowed to to study, and like our thing, my thing for that week was like, I want to learn everything I can about shipworms. So I did, and I researched more, and I looked around and found lots of questions people didn't have about shipworms, and that no one was studying them very much at the time. So when I came time to look for PhD projects, I came up with ideas and wrote to people around the world and said like, hey, here's a really interesting thing that people aren't really studying. Like, can I work on shipworms with you? And I think they all just took a moment, read, like had to look up what shipworms were, and then said, okay, sure. But it also meant that like I had to teach myself, really, because there was no one else around who had ever studied worked on shipworms or knew what they were. So I've had a long history of having to explain to people what shipworms are, and be enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, well, you have been, and thank you very much. If there aren't any more questions, I'll say thank you, and I'll just stop the recording. Okay,